Alright, YouTube, there's a link to Enenews posted in the description. Before I get into Fukushima, though, before I uploaded the last video on hemp production, I didn't think to show you this. This is a Masonic booklet. I can't remember. This is Bylaws and Rules of Order of Hopkins Lodge Number 87, Independent Order of Odd Fellows, State of Pennsylvania. This was printed in 1851. It's over 150 years old, and other than slight yellowing, it essentially looks like it could have been printed yesterday. You probably can't read that very much, but whatever. It's printed on hemp. Back before it was illegal to do so. Back before pulp paper edged it out because they injected hemp into the argument with marijuana during the temperance movement, which I just discussed. I just thought I'd throw that out there, that there are extant copies of texts printed over a century ago that were printed on hemp. And again, as someone who collects these booklets and books, they are in much better condition than anything printed on cheaper pulp paper. Archival stock, essentially, is the only non-hemp paper that stands up as long as this. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. But to Fukushima. According to the Enenews article, apparently TEPCO lied again. This is a regular event now. It's slowed down some, probably because of that law that they passed over in Japan to keep whistleblowers silent, essentially making it impossible for journalists to leak anything considered classified. Well, anything on Fukushima can be considered inside info between TEPCO and the government, so essentially the purpose of this was to stop people from talking about Fukushima because they know that it's a bad situation. This time, TEPCO apparently underestimated the release of strontium and other beta emitters by an order of magnitude, by 1,000%, by 10 times. And actually, let me open up the article, if I can find it here. It's probably on my tabs here. Oh, yeah, here it is. Let's look through this. Record high 10 million becquerels per liter of strontium-90 in beta emitters finally revealed in Fukushima plant groundwater, 1,000% more than TEPCO claimed for the last 6 months. Now, because I'm not a nuclear physicist, and because, let's face it, probably nobody watching this video is a nuclear physicist, I don't know particularly what that means in large-scale terms. What I do know from the limited amount that I've studied the issue is that that is an extremely high number. It's not low. It is a concerning number, and this is material that's flowing into the Pacific Ocean every single day, of every single week, of every single month, of every single year, and has been since Fukushima melted down to begin with, or shortly thereafter. 400 tons of this material every day. They claim, day in and day out, that this material it's not releasing enough radioactivity to affect the ocean at large, or even much beyond that little bay that's right outside Fukushima. Essentially, they've got the seawall. Shinzo Abe proclaimed that it wasn't affecting anything outside of that, and yet fish caught 100 miles south were showing up with 250 times more cesium than the allowable limit. What other radioactive source do you suppose is in the Pacific that's causing that effect? They're finding radioactivity in kelp off California now that's approaching or above the limit for what you can consider a material that can be considered edible. There's no other source that can account for that drastic a rise in radioactivity. There simply exists no other site anywhere in the Pacific area that's releasing radioactivity at a high enough level. Yeah, there's coal mine tailings going down some river. There's, the occasional release of tritium at some other plant. I think it's fairly obvious that the 3 reactors that melted down and the one that exploded probably is the culprit here. Of course, they've said this rise in the radioactivity of fish and kelp and so forth off the coast of the United States just is magically coinciding with the arrival of the edge of that radioactive plume that was released from Fukushima in the first place. And yet, no mention from the mainstream media. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to mention it in a news report. You have to go to completely underground news sources to hear anything about this. And the people who are leaking this information probably, in many many cases are paying for it with their free time, because they end up getting thrown in jail. These whistleblowers and people who are actually reporting on the situation. I'm surprised that Japan hasn't simply filtered its entire internet capability and gone off the grid, so to speak, and internalized its internet and looked at everything that people are searching for and putting out online. It's completely ridiculous. Here we have TEPCO, regardless of what this actual number means, even if you have no knowledge of nuclear matters at all, the fact that they underestimated it by 10 times is concerning. Regardless, it's like if you say, well, I have one kitten and it turns out you have 10 kittens, that's a substantial difference. You may have a big enough house that 10 kittens isn't going to overwhelm you, but it's still 10 times more than you said that you had. It's noticeable. You say, I've got one kitten, and then behind you there's a row of 10 kittens. Magically, how did that happen? I never knew. 6 months have passed and I never saw any other kittens. It's crazy to think that TEPCO didn't know about this and just delay mentioning it. Essentially, you've got a situation. They've also talked in the past. I should have done an update some time ago, because at least one of the Swiss company that came in and surveyed, at least one of their diagrams appears to show the corium clearly marked as probably below containment. That's probably where the radioactivity is coming from. It doesn't make sense that it's coming from any other source, so we've got to assume at least some of it has escaped containment now and is below the structure. Whether this means that it'll continue to sink or whether it'll just sit there like a poisonous blob poisoning the Pacific forever, we don't know. But TEPCO has lied so much about facts and figures and literally everything that's gone on the site, and the government has been so complicit because Japan's relying on nuclear energy, apparently, that you can't take anything that they say at this point seriously anymore. I had my doubts about TEPCO being capable of releasing an honest report months ago. This takes the cake as far as how dishonest they can possibly be in pushing the idea that there's nothing wrong with the site. Well, when radioactivity levels in edible organisms that are being actively fished are rising hundreds of times, that's clearly due to Fukushima. There is no other source to account for this radioactivity. What Japan probably doesn't want are a bunch of fishermen from other Pacific nations, coastal areas, suing them for ruining their ability to make a living. What they probably want is to keep environmentalist organizations from suing them or from protesting the entire nation of Japan. They don't want to lose tourism. They were dumping radioactive waste not far outside of Tokyo and burning it. They don't want anyone to think that there's anything wrong. Well, there is something wrong. Fukushima is falling apart. The coriums have probably breached the containment units below the actual reactors. There is radioactivity coming from Fukushima and being absorbed into living organisms that would potentially, think about it, there are third world nations in that region that don't have stringent testing for radioactivity in their produce. There are countries that are still getting fish from Japan. It doesn't even matter if they get their fish from Japan now, because there's so much radioactivity being spread around. 400 tons a day of this apparently highly radioactive water is leaking out. There's so much radioactivity that it's going to begin to spread throughout the entire Pacific, possibly further. Could it enter the Indian Ocean? Probably. I don't know much about ocean currents, but I'm assuming a storm could sweep a little bit of it out there. These other countries, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Russians living on the Pacific, although there aren't as many as in the other side of their country, the United States, Chile, Peru. Do any of these countries ring a bell? All of these countries have fishermen going out and catching fish in the Pacific. And their catch is being tainted. There's going to come a point at which the food, either you have to continuously raise the limits of what's acceptable to keep eating that produce and not alarming people, and they've already raised the limits here in the United States, which everyone understood was underhanded and fishy, or you have to say, well, I guess we can't eat any Pacific caught fish because it's all tainted with radioactivity. And depending on the species of fish, it's anywhere from a fairly small increase that probably won't hurt anyone unless you're feeding it to your newborn baby or a pregnant woman, to quite a drastic rise, 250 times above allowable levels, seen, I believe, in salmon, is quite a bit. Of course, salmon tends to take up all sorts of bad shit. They are constantly high in mercury, too. Tuna's the same thing. These are popular fish to eat. These are the fish that sardines too were being affected. These are fish that many people choose to eat. They're some of the more popular varieties. You don't hear about people eating, you know, lionfish that have had their poisonous spines removed and things like that. And no one cares if it affects the fugi. These are common staples that people eat on a regular basis, and they are being poisoned by radioactivity. Even if you don't end up with fish covered in tumors and becoming infertile and growing a fin out of their eyeball, even if you don't end up with that, you're still eating that radioactivity. It doesn't take much to be unsafe. Yes, there's natural radioactivity in the world. Everyone knows this. The amount that's being dumped is far greater than the background level. I think that's clear, and I think people are focused so much on monitoring on land or on the coast, or they're monitoring the water itself in the ocean. They're not stopping to think most of this water is going down into the sludge, getting filtered through by crustaceans and minnows, and entering the food chain directly. The reason why the radioactivity level has not increased so much, it's being absorbed by living things that are not being tested. So when we test a fish and find 250 times the allowable level, and we test the water and it's barely above what used to be background, that's the reason, because those fish and kelp are taking in the lion's share of this material. And even that which is not taken in right away around Japan or around this plume is spread out in the water. It's going through sponges and other filter feeders and entering the food chain anyway. It'll be a matter of time before all of the radioactivity has at one point or another been part of the food chain. That's about all. Peace out.